This is a recording that I wanted to do of my pedagogy independent study presentation that I did early today, but I wanted to record it again so that I could put it on YouTube for later use for anyone who might find the content educational or helpful in any way. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to go ahead and apologize if I'm looking down. I'm looking at my notes on my phone about the presentation. So I'm paying attention and I'm invested, but I want to make sure I cover everything. So here we go. We're going to start with what the project was. So I had to research two different types of instruments, percussion instruments, and the pedagogy and the methods repertoire, the themes that I found that were developed throughout a percussionist journey from the beginner level of a snare drum player or a keyboard player, to mallet specifically, to the end of their journey as a snare drummer or to mallet keyboard player. Of course, to mallet keyboard players towards the end of the journey or towards the more independent part of their journey would begin developing their skills for four mallets as well as continuing their skills for two mallets. But I wanted to dive in deep on two mallets and just focus on that. So I'm going to screen share my snare drum presentation. I chose to do a timeline because I thought that would be interesting and fun. And it progresses from the beginner level through auditions, through middle school, through all district, through high school, into auditions for university level, into upper university levels, and eventually into the idea that you have become a master. You've put in the 10,000 hours to become a master at this. So here we go. Each kind of stage, beginner, intermediate, and masters has examples of beginning method books, beginning repertoire, and a theme that I'm going to talk about. So this is The Two Hands of a Snare Drummer, Journey Through a Percussionist's Life as a Musician, shown through their repertoire and method books. So here are 3 examples of beginning method books and a couple examples of beginning repertoire, and then the theme for beginners and the idea that kept reoccurring in all the research that I was doing was this idea that you want to make drumming and beginning percussion as accessible and approachable as possible. You don't want to scare away the students because they don't have access to an instrument or because they're getting overwhelmed or for whatever reason. You want to make it accessible to everyone, no matter their like financial status or anything that could affect their accessibility. You make it approachable. One way to make it accessible is to teach students how to play the snare drum without having an actual physical snare drum. One of my favorite methods is to, if you have access to sticks, is to take the stick and normally you would play it like this, but then you flip it around so the beat is at the bottom and you play it against the meat of your arm, and that keeps this same wrist motion that you would be using. But you don't have to be playing on a drum, and you still get that feeling of it hitting skin, which is kind of interesting to think about, but you still get that feeling of it hitting skin. If a student doesn't have access to sticks at home or wherever they are, I also really enjoy doing conga hands, which is the term for using your hands to drum on everything, because it's that idea of, well, this is how I play congas. So you would just like get that wrist motion, but you're drumming on any surface you can find. The nice thing about having a pillow or a blanket or something is it has that resistance, so it builds up the muscles in your arms. But you don't have to, just to get students moving and interested and invested at the very beginning. So I looked at beginning elementary, beginning middle, and worked into beginning to intermediate level. So snare, you want to start with full strokes and reading rhythms, the different kinds of notes, whole notes, half notes, all the way up until 16th notes. You don't really introduce triplets at the beginning because that can be confusing, whereas 16th notes are really steady, your right, left, really even and steady. You want to introduce easy check patterns like 8 on a hand or 16th note rhythm check patterns. And it's really important to start introducing theory to these students because a lot of time when you're playing snare, you're not introduced to aural skills or solfege or stuff like that because it's not seen as important. But it is really important to introduce that while you're introducing these rhythms. Um, you want to begin teaching the ideas of full strokes above all. But once they get that, you want to teach the idea of the 4 basic stroke types. So downstroke, upstroke, taps, and the full stroke as you introduce the rudiments. Going into 8th grade, all students, according to the North Carolina Bandmasters Association, should be able to play 4 rudiments, the rudimental long roll, the orchestral buzz roll, flams, single paradiddles, and be able to sight read at the grade 1 and 2. A work that I focused on is this work right here, Snare Brain by Chris Rude. I thought it was really fun. It has a fun name. It grabs students' attention. So that's really nice. This one is a compilation, it's a book. So it's a compilation of 7 solos, 2 duets, and 1 trio. And it represents a contemporary approach to rhythmic technical demands of playing snare drum. The very first solo is one that I looked at. It's called Reverberation, and it deals with full strokes, easy rhythms, and rests, which rests are really important to introduce to students because they're going to be doing a lot of that later. And that idea of giving enough time for a rest, a lot of people want to rush and play through rest. I know I do a lot. You want to develop that idea of your rest has to be equal to the amount of your note. It's also a really slow tempo, and it starts to introduce them to dynamics, which is really good to start to introduce students to. Okay, as we travel through into middle school and all district auditions and starting into high school, you're entering the intermediate level. You want to continue working on the different stroke types. You want to introduce triplets and different time signatures like 6, 8, and compound meters and stuff like that, to get them used to everything. You really want to introduce dynamics and the contrast of dynamics, pianissimo versus fortissimo, and all the nuances and stuff that go with that. You want to introduce them to the concept of their sound and how it's affected by where they're playing on the drum. If you play in the center of the head, it's going to sound differently than if you play on the edge of the head, and how that ties in with dynamics is important to introduce them to. You also want to introduce them to the PAS 40 of international rudiments. That's like the cornerstone of all snare playing. You want to introduce them different types of snares and how you would approach them, starting into marching band and symphonic bands and like different stuff. They all have different snare drums or can have different snare drums, and you would approach each of those snare drums differently. The North Carolina Bandmasters Association says that by 10th grade, you should be able to play the above rudiments, but now you should be able to sight read at grades 2 to 3. The work that I focused on for this section was Paradiddle Riddle, which is this last one by Danny Raymond. I really like Danny Raymond's work because he has a lot of these beginner, intermediate to intermediate solos, so it's really nice if you find that you like his compositional style. As a beginner, you can kind of progress with him until you get to advanced level, but it's really nice because you can read his music, and a lot of his music comes with exercises that are specific to the work that you're working on, like this one. Paradiddle Riddle takes the idea of working around the paradiddle, which showcases all 4 stroke types. This piece is fast at 196 beats per minute in order to keep the performer thinking while they play, which is important because a lot of people play but they don't think about what they're doing as they're playing. You have to have dynamic control as well as an introduction to rim shots, so the different techniques, again with implementing different sounds out of the drum and the instrument. I already said that this comes with sheet music that has warm-ups specific to this exercise, which can be really, really helpful. Now, as we advanced into the intermediate and into college, as you audition for that, You want to focus on rudiments and awareness of the instrument. You want to do new meters, roll techniques, but you really want to develop your techniques in preparation for orchestral music and a deeper sense of how you fit in an ensemble, because you want to move from, you still want to work as a solo artist, but you also want to be able to work with other people within ensembles, because that's what a lot of snare drummers do. They don't just play snare drum for their entire life, they play snare within an ensemble. So you want to continue the above techniques as you go into college. You want to start working on orchestral techniques though, which would be rudimental techniques, with rudimental drumming, um, French style versus German style snare drum playing versus American style snare drum playing, which is an introduction to the world techniques. According to North Carolina Bandmasters Association, you want to play the above rudiments, but be able to sight read at grade 4 to 5 and higher. Of course, I'm playing Swerve right now, so I wanted to talk about Swerve. I really like Swerve by Gene Koshinsky because it has different kinds of rudiments, it has recurring themes, so once you learn something, you come back to it and can get better at it. It also is really fast, and it has different sounds and different techniques to get those sounds out. You get to play the snare drum with a knitting needle, and you get to play the snare drum with a stick that has a spring on the end of it, as well as playing snare drum with your fingers and like playing, flicking out the rudiments and stuff like that. So that's really cool, and I really love that solo. Okay, as you go into the advanced stage, you've become a master, you've put in your hours. Of course, you want to start working on orchestral snare works like Scheherazade, Lieutenant Kiji. Those are standards in the orchestral community, standards for auditions. Um, you also want to continue the above techniques. You just want to continue working on everything that you've worked on so far, but you've put in all the work, so you can start specializing in and like focusing in, zeroing in on something that you really want to get better at. There's a supplemental method book here at the bottom that I think is really cool. It's the Modern Contest Snare Drum Roll. It's a book it's like hundreds of pages dedicated just to improving your concert snare drum roll, which is insane and blows my mind, and I can't wait to get this book and get better at my snare drum rolls. But so you want to continue the above techniques, and then you want to this is a stage where you start researching, why am I doing this, why do I use this technique over this one to create this sound, and that just ultimately helps you develop your sound and become a better musician. You also want to be specializing, focusing in, zeroing in on the stuff that you need to get better at. The piece that I wanted to talk about for this section was this one right here, War Drum Peace Drum by David Reeves. I've listened to this one and I thought it was really cool. The interesting thing is that this one is a solo work with audio, so you're combining live in-person playing with a recording and something that's going behind you, which is really cool, something that you really wouldn't think about doing until you reach this upper advanced master level. And it also develops this idea that is devoid of rudiments, so you've like transcended this rudimental drumming and you're just thinking about your sound and not like the rudiment that you're playing underneath it to create this sound, which is really cool. There's dynamic control, which is key to this piece. There's a contrast between the snare drum playing and the audio, which is also really cool. And then of course you want to dive into orchestral works. At the very bottom, I put these supplemental method books, which can be used at any level of playing. I really want to get Chop Busters because it sounds really fun and like it would kick my butt and make me a much better person. I'm working out of stick control right now, so all of these can be used and they help implement different ideas and like make you a better overall percussionist. And then my second one was the mallet, two mallets. Let's see if I can get it pulled up. Stop sharing, and then I'm going to share again. This time it will be this. See if I can make it bigger. Oh goodness. Awesome. Okay. This is the two hands of a mallet player, journey through a percussionist life as a musician, shown through the repertoire and method books. So this one, again, tracks it from beginning to masters. This time I'm going to start with the supplementary method books to remind you that you can use it from the beginning to the very end of your career. Some of these can be used for sight reading or daily exercises. I really like this 200 daily exercises for xylophone because every day the exercise gets harder and challenges the student, and you have 200 days, and they say that it takes 30 days to start a habit. So can you imagine how good and how like solid the habit would be if you did 200 straight days of exercises? That'd be so good. I'm really interested in mallet control because it's the same as stick control, only for mallets. So I'm going to check that one out next. Okay. At the beginning of two mallet repertoire. So my theme for this one, again, was accessibility and approachability. It can be kind of intimidating to play like a bell set, which is usually what beginners will start on because they're so loud and they're so small and they look so delicate. It can be hard to approach them, but just remind your students that they're approachable. And then if they don't have access to a bell kit, like I was fortunate, I had a bell kit at home, but it was only an octave. So after like I started learning music that was more than an octave, it became useless. So I would sit down at the piano and play out the notes so that I was hearing them, and then play with sticks or mallets or just conga hands on the floor to get that motion of that full stroke, because this mallets also utilize the full stroke at this point. So mallets at the beginner, elementary or middle, wherever you're starting, level should use the full stroke as well. You should develop a basic reading of music combined with reading rhythms from the snare drum if you're doing them side by side, which you should be doing, in my opinion. How to find notes. You want to teach your student these anchor points. To me, B flat has always stuck out for some reason, which I think is really odd that of all notes would stick out, but it's the last one in the grouping of 3, and I'm always like, that one is B flat. I automatically know because I was taught to anchor myself to the B flat. I had a friend who anchored themselves to the note D, like they always knew where the D was, because if you think a dog has 2 floppy ears and the D is in the center of the upper 2 notes from the manual, so they have 2 little ears, which I think is really cute that they learn that way. And then you want to start with 1 or 2 scales. Start with the F or the B flat or maybe even E flat scales, because a lot of times beginners start in those mixed groups, and that's what the woodwinds or the brass will be starting with, those scales. So it's just natural to start with those scales. North Carolina Bandmasters Association says that by 8th grade, all students should be able to play scales 1 octave up and down plus the arpeggio, and they should be able to play the G, C, E, B flat, E flat, and A flat scales. As well as your C chromatic scale 1 octave up and down. And students should be able to sight read at grades 1 to 2. The work that I found here that was really interesting was this Anasazi by Alice Gomez, this one right here. This piece utilizes arpeggiated figures and straightforward scale passages, and it's by a female composer. You want to introduce your students to diverse composers as soon as possible. But this one's really cool because you're teaching them new scales and developing their awareness of the board, and that's what this solo is based on, is the different beginning scales and arpeggios, which is really important. Okay, moving on for the beginner intermediate levels. So you want to, in middle school and high school, you're auditioning for all district, you're getting ready for college. Here are some of those method books and some of the repertoire, as well as the themes. So you want to develop scales, awareness of instruments and the different kinds of instruments and how some of them are larger, some of them are smaller, and you want to talk about world techniques as well as new meters. So in this beginner intermediate 8th grade to 11th grade-ish You want to continue working on the full stroke, but with the idea that you don't have to play at your eyes. A lot of students play like all the way full shoulder arm contact with the keyboard. You don't really need that. You want to draw the sound out of the instrument and create this beautiful sound. You want to introduce them to triplets and different time signatures, as well as introducing them to the concept of their sound, just like on snare drum where you play on the bar or where you play on the head affects what kind of sound you get out of the instrument. You also want to introduce them to different approaches to the different instruments. On vibraphone, I always use vibraphone as the example, but on vibraphone, there's this thing that you have to put your foot on and pedal up and down the pedal, which adds a whole nother set of challenges to a student, because not only are they having to use these limbs, they also have to use a leg and like balance where to pedal. And each instrument, not just vibraphone, marimba, or whatever, each mallet instrument has its own unique challenges and unique ways to approach it. So you need to be aware of those. According to the North Carolina Bandmasters Association, by 10th grade, all students should be able to play 2-octave scales with arpeggios up and down, plus with the scales that I mentioned above, plus the D flat scale, and then sight reading at grades 2 and 3. The one I wanted to talk about, the repertoire, the solo, that's the word I'm looking for, solo, that I wanted to talk about was African Fantasy of Joy to the World by Jessie Ayers, this one right here. I picked this one because there are a lot of solos out there that are focused and like based on pieces that students have already heard and like are familiar with, and that is key, because if you can teach a student to be above reading the music, like to use their ears and listen to the notes because they're familiar with the tune, they can hear when they're doing something wrong. But this one is interesting because it adds African rhythms and those world ideas into something that's already familiar. So they can hear when they've made mistakes, but they're also getting introduced to these bigger concepts. As you move into 12th grade, college, you're getting into these advanced ideas. Of course, you want to start working on orchestral keyboard, because that's where a lot of 2 mallet upper advanced music comes from. It's from these orchestral symphonic works. 12th grade, college, you want to continue the above techniques that I talked about and work on orchestral techniques. You want to add in the idea that the mallet itself affects the sound. Up until this point, students probably haven't had jobs or haven't had the dedication or the motivation to pour what money they do have into their own equipment, but now they're in the upper level. They should buy their own equipment, and this helps develop their own personal sound. The mallet that you use affects the sound of the board, which affects the sound that you're creating in turn. So that's why students should be thinking about the mallets and their mallet choices and stuff like that. And of course, you want to introduce your student and start teaching them minor scales and modes. I think you should be teaching these well before now, but North Carolina Band Association says that the above scales is all that a student needs to know up until they get to college. But now their student needs to be sight reading at grade 4 or 5 and above. The work that I wanted to look at for this one was a book by Gene Krasinski. It is called Two, and it's all 2 mallet books. The really nice thing again about this one is that the solos progress with the students. So the solos start really easy and then they get really hard. Will in my class actually played Prelude Nuevo, which is one of the harder books, and it sounded really cool, and it had like this kind of like Latin feel to it. It was really cool. And I really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend Gene Krasinski's Two book. All right, now that you're in college and beyond and becoming a master, you're in the advanced level of playing 2 mallet percussion, you really want to double down and focus on orchestral music, because that's where a lot of 2 mallet percussion comes from, and I already said that, but I want to emphasize it. And it's all this idea of how to play within an ensemble, because percussion ensembles, orchestral works, symphonic works, all of that deals with to mallet playing more than the solos do at this point. You want to continue working on the above techniques. You want to introduce more styles of music and listening with your ears within the ensemble and being able to read rhythms. Pretty much the same thing that I said for snare drum. You can dive more deeper into specific works and stuff like that. The work that I focused on here is by Kyoko Abbey. She has two versions of this work. There's Prism and there's Prism Rhapsody. One is a concerto for marimba and orchestra, and one is a solo work. Both two mallets. They're pretty similar pieces. The solo work, it is said that Kyoko Abbey plays this as a warm-up every day and before all of her like shows and stuff, which I think is, I mean, it leaves me speechless. This piece is insane. You need to go look it up and watch her play this. It's so fast, and it works between the upper and lower manuals, and it works on dynamics, and it jumps from one end of the marimba to the other. And it uses extended techniques. You use the shaft of the mallet to play against the bars instead of using just the head of the mallet. The same goes for Prism Rhapsody. Except it's fast and moving up and down the manuals and stuff, but you're using those techniques in the context of a big orchestral work. Yeah, and I really like both those pieces. And then of course you want to work on things like Porgy and Bess and American Paris, Appalachian Springs, those kind of orchestral works that become important at that stage. One question that I got asked during this research is, I talk a lot about the North Carolina Band Masters Association. Is there anything that I would change in their guidelines that they put? And that's an excellent question. I talk about it a lot because that's the system and the like guidelines that I grew up under, that I learned percussion under, and there are so many things that I would change, but the big thing that I would change is the requirements and the guidelines that students are required to learn only these set skills by this age level. Sometimes that can hold students back. I know it held me back, this idea that I only needed to know 4 rudiments and I only needed to be able to play them slow, fast, slow. And I only really needed to be able to play them once a year when I auditioned for all district. I didn't need to work on them any other time. Held me back. It kept me from learning the PAS 40 or learning that there were even more rudiments out there than just those 4 that the Bandmasters Association asked for. If they had asked for more every year, like it's the same 4 rudiments from elementary beginning level all the way until your last year that you can audition, which is 12th grade, senior year of high school. So once you learn them, you've learned them and you're good, or at least that's how I saw it. But if they required a new rudiment every year as you progress, then who knows, I would have learned at least like 13 or more rudiments by the time I entered college instead of trying to learn all 40 at the same time. With 2 mallets, I have the same problem with the Bandmasters Association and the idea that you only need to know those scales. You should definitely be learning your minor scales and your modes before you enter college, instead of just learning the standard scales. And that is my presentation. Thank you for listening or watching.